Hello and welcome to God and the Family, a series where I, Gershly Karen Pierre, speak about biblical concepts and tie that into our population, our families, our communities, and of course, our God, so that we can help make better sense of our place in this world and what I perceive would be God's ideal society for us. Today's scripture is in Zephaniah 2, verses 1. Which states, "Gather yourselves together, gather together, O nation not desired." To summarize Zephaniah chapter 2, which speaks on God's people being scattered throughout the world via enslavement, being held in captivity, which is oppression and domination, and other groups who, these are different nations throughout Zephaniah 2, hate God's people, and how God is going to redeem us from the judgment that we earned after all the sins we've done against Him, but also how God will repay the nations after all they've done against us. Zephaniah 2 is a story of redemption, forgiveness, retribution, and healing. And if you would like to read Zephaniah 2 for yourself, I encourage you to. It's lovely, and knowing that God is going to heal us, set us free from our bondage, is a super gift. But specifically focusing on verse 1. I have questions, and I've shared this in other God and the Family episodes. For example, quiverful, take wives, take husbands. Don't you notice that God will often tell His people, who He speaks about them being in a vulnerable, oppressed position, how to counter their position, and it's typically via unity as well as the increase of population serving as a wall of defense? Number 2, what does that imply about God knowing their predicament and God creating a solution that is not somehow outside of them to figure out? And how can we as a people internalize these points of God's strategy and not seek to change the mind frame of others? Throughout the scripture, the position of Israelites was constantly dealing with abuse. The world they lived in, the world we live in, is a world that is infrastructurally on the bottom. And yet God always had a suitable counter-narrative to teach His people a better way out of their frailties. And I look forward to when we can, as a demographic, fulfill prophecy, fulfill scripture, because throughout the Old Testament it talks about God taking His people out of captivity. We can look forward to God eventually redeeming us from our current predicament. But as we do, it's going to force us to realize internally, not externally, is where the solution is, and internally not to change the external issues, rather to strengthen ourselves, build a core identity between ourselves and with our God. Yes, we are a nation not desired. But God's solution to that is through the strategy of unity, which is to be gathered together. And He says it twice. Gather yourselves together. And He says gather together. And even when He says that's technically saying it 3 times. Affirming that as a nation not desired, the solution to that is within ourselves desiring who we are. Think of all of our movements, anything from boycotts to revolutions, rebellions, so much that happened to us historically, and how those were waged as we decided to unite. And they were successful only because we worked together. And we were on the bottom. So imagine what it could be if we were to fulfill this scripture and not just being on the bottom, because if we got so much done back in those days and we were in more dire constraints in many ways than we are today, what could it be like if we were to then modernize this concept? And this is my perception on the issue. I believe it's going to get to the point where we, regardless of our class, so I'm talking those who are at the top of society, regardless of where they live on the planet and the languages they speak, I believe it's going to get to that point where people within us are going to apply to this scripture. Of just this concept of enough And the feeding on knowing that is the realization that, hey, we are not alone. There are people who can empathize. There are people who understand, and they are our people. I'm excited for the era where God is going to renew our minds, our hearts, our paradigms, perspectives, because as a people, we're lost, we're divided, we're scattered, we're in captivity, we're dealing with many different frailties, and by the grace of God, through covenant prophecy, God himself will deliver us, like he has throughout all time, but this time, after years and years of us being divorced from even knowing him as our God, knowing we were his people, and this time on levels that we previously have not seen. So thank you so much for listening. Stay tuned for more.